2026, in the weeks before a high-stakes summit in Beijing, a cascade of crises has converged to make a presidential trip into one of the most fraught diplomatic events of recent memory. On the calendar, a meeting between the leaders of the world's two biggest economies is scheduled for May 14 and 15, a carefully choreographed chance for Washington and Beijing to try to stabilize trade, manage competition, and build guardrails against miscalculation. But behind the photo opportunities and joint communiques, a web of strategic tensions has tightened. A blunt warning from Beijing over Taiwan, an intensifying standoff with Iran at sea, a reshaping of global energy markets, and a fracture inside OPEC that is already reverberating across the Gulf. Beijing's message to Washington has been unmistakable. Taiwan has been cast as a red line, not simply a policy preference, but a matter Beijing describes as central to its core interest and domestic legitimacy in recent actions. Seized between China's foreign minister and his American counterpart, the tone was not the thinly veiled diplomacy of businesslike disagreement. It was solemn, direct, and designed to leave no doubt about the limits Beijing will assert when the two presidents meet. Regional capitals from Tokyo to Taipei and beyond are watching closely, attuned to any nuance that might signal a shift in posture or a step toward escalation. For Washington, the problem is how to reconcile long-standing commitments to Taiwan's democratic self-governance with a larger strategic aim, keeping competition with China from tipping into direct conflict. That tension is the backdrop to the summit in Beijing, an event intended to test whether both sides can construct the crisis management mechanisms that have been frayed by years of rivalry. Officials on both sides are said to be preparing to negotiate not a roadmap to resolution, but practical protocols, crisis communications, military-to-military lines, and terms are finand at preventing accidents from spiraling into confrontation. If Taiwan is an existential line for Beijing, the Persian Gulf has become a pressure point for Washington. Since major hostilities erupted earlier this year, maritime warfare and interdiction have reshaped the routes that nations and companies depend on for oil and trade. The waters around the Strait of Hormuz, a choke point that has long carried a significant share of the world's seaborne oil, have once again become the focus of global anxiety. The United States, pursuing a strategy intended to deny Iran the revenues needed to fund its strategic programs, has implemented maritime measures designed to restrict Tehran's ability to move oil and other goods through its ports. The result has been a dramatic disruption to traditional energy flows and a scramble by states and companies to find alternatives. Iran, faced with crippling constraints on its seaborne exports, has been forced to improvise. Reporting from regional outlets and financial press has documented efforts to expand overland corridors through neighboring countries, test limited rail and road routes, and open smaller crossings to ad hoc partners. Those measures can blunt the blow of maritime interdiction, but they do not replace the volume and comparative ease of tanker traffic through open sea lanes. The logistical reinvention is at once a tactical response and a strategic gamble. In the short run, rerouting helps Tehran preserve some revenue. Over the long run, it highlights how brittle even the most entrenched trade systems can be when the seas become contested. These moves are not confined to the economic ledger. They are geopolitical leverage. Hydrocarbon revenue has long underpinned the state budgets of many of the region's regimes, funding security apparatus and social programs alike. Deny a government the cash flow and you create pressure that can be exploited in negotiations. But pressure invites countermeasures and countermeasures, whether asymmetric attacks on shipping, proxy strikes, or the forging of new trade partnerships, can widen the conflict, inflicting cost on global markets and on nations that are only tangentially involved. Into that already volatile mix came one of the biggest shocks to market dynamics: Abu Dhabi's announcement late in April that the United Arab Emirates would withdraw from OPEC. The decision, framed by Emirati leaders as an assertion of production autonomy and a realignment of long-term energy strategy, diminishes the cartel's cohesion and undercuts its ability to coordinate output. For consumers and markets, a structurally smaller OPEC could mean less disciplined supply management and, over time, more competitive pricing. But the immediate effect is uncertainty. Will other members follow? How will Saudi Arabia, still the de facto leader of the group, respond? And what does this mean for Washington's effort to shape regional energy policy, for the White House, the UAE? These departure is a welcome development. Another sign, officials say that regional partners are responsive to calls for higher output and lower prices. The president publicly framed the move in starkly transactional terms and used the moment to underline his administration's posture on energy and regional strategy. That posture, a mix of sanctions, interdiction, and public brinkmanship, is designed to squeeze Tehran until it offers concessions on its nuclear and missile programs. It is also a posture that, if misread, risks prompting a forceful response. The president has defended the maritime strategy in stark, unmistakable language. He said, well, the blockade is genius. Okay, the blockade has been 100% foolproof. It shows how good our Navy is. I can tell you that nobody's going to play games. We have the greatest military in the world, and I got much of it during my first term, and we've been building it since. And the greatest anywhere in the world, nobody even close. And you see that whether it's Venezuela, and they have a good military in Venezuela, but it was over in one day. It was actually over in about 48 minutes. Iran, the same thing. I mean, militarily, we've wiped them out. They have no military left there. It's all the navies at the bottom of the sea. The Air Force is never going to fly again. We've got an amazing military now. Now they have to cry, uncle. That's all they have to do. Just say we give up. We give up. Those remarks, combative, boastful, and meant to telegraph resolve, also strip away the subtlety that can be necessary in crisis management. Public bluster can reassure some domestic audiences while simultaneously narrowing the options available to adversaries who feel their survival is threatened. Iran's official posture has so far been defiant. State media and senior Iranian voices frame external pressure as an existential test, pledging to protect what Tehran calls sovereign rights and promising resilience, in the face of sanctions and interdiction. The rhetoric is designed both to galvanize domestic audiences and to deter regional rivals, but it also raises the odds that miscalculation could lead to kinetic escalation at sea or along contested borders. It is precisely because the stakes are so high that the White House has cast the trip to Beijing as more than a trade mission. Diplomats and aides in Washington privately described the summit as an opportunity to press China to use or at least consider its leverage over Iran to push Tehran toward negotiations that reduce military risk. If Beijing values stable commerce and global standing, the argument goes, it has an incentive to nudge Tehran away from behaviors that imperil shipping lanes and global markets. For Beijing, the calculation is different but complementary. China can use the summit to assert a vision of multipolarity and to protect its economic interests while insisting on its own limits, especially where Taiwan is concerned. Yet summits are fragile instruments. Trust is scarce and the capacity to compel compliance is uneven. Beijing's insistence that Taiwan is non-negotiable collides with Washington's commitments and with Taipei's own determination to govern itself. Simultaneously, the maritime pressure campaign in the Gulf has exposed the limits of naval power as a tool of compellence. Iran's efforts to adapt, finding new routes, new partners, and overland corridors show that economic coercion can be porous, producing costly unintended consequences rather than clean results. The coming days will be watched not just in capitals, but on trading floors, in ports, and in boardrooms. Energy traders will pass every phrase for hints about supply and spare capacity. Defense planners will review naval postures in the Gulf and the Red Sea. Diplomats will look for signals, a handshake, a joint statement, a nod toward coordinated restraint that might arrest a slide toward larger conflict. Inside both means aides are drafting talking points that straddle the practical and the existential. They recognize that a durable agreement on Taiwan is improbable. What is possible and what they will likely pursue are mechanisms to prevent accidents, crisis hotlines, clearer rules of engagement, and agreed steps to de-escalate encounters between ships and aircraft. On Iran, the hope is to see whether Beijing will accept a role as a mediator, using its economic ties with Tehran to broker limited, verifiable steps that reduce the appetite for maritime confrontation. Domestic politics will complicate any bargain. Leaders in both countries face pressures that can make compromise politically risky. Regional allies, from Tokyo to capitals across the Middle East, will be watching for signs that the relationship between Washington and Beijing can be managed in a way that protects their security and economic interests. For many smaller states, the calculus is not ideological. It is pragmatic, the sell. EU routes by which they import goods, export energy, and finance their budgets depend on stability in sea lanes and diplomatic predictability, and then there is the marketplace. A fracture inside OPEC, an ongoing campaign of maritime interdiction, and the spectre of wider military engagement feed uncertainty into oil prices, freight costs, and investment decisions. Companies and sovereigns will adjust to new realities, investments in alternative routes, hedging strategies to protect supply chains, and contingency plans that reroute commerce away from hotspots. Those adaptations will take time, and the short-term costs, higher energy prices, disrupted trade flows, and the political fallout of shortages will be paid by consumers and economies around the world. So what might the summit produce? The realistic best-case scenario is modest, a set of commitments and communication mechanisms that reduce the risk of accidental clashes, a joint statement that emphasizes restraint, and an agris, meant for leaders, envoys, to pursue follow-on talks on both Iran and Taiwan-related risk reduction. Even that would be a heavy lift. The worst-case scenario is that the summit produces little more than posturing, and that the underlying tensions over reunification, regional influence, and the contest of maritime power deepen in ways that quick statements cannot fix. The trip to Beijing will be a test of whether summit diplomacy can still function as a stabilizing force in an age of rapid escalation. It will test whether bold rhetoric and hard power can be balanced by patient diplomacy and credible crisis management. For President Xi, the summit is an opportunity to shore up global standing and to assert a vision where no single power dictates terms. For President Trump, it is a chance to secure cooperation or at least restraint from Beijing on Iran and to seek assurances that Taipei will not become an immediate flashpoint. Neither president can now control all the variables. The world is watching because the margins for error are thin. The language leaders choose, the private understandings they reach, and the systems they put in place in the days after their meetings could either quiet the tremors at the edge of the global order or allow them to grow into something far more dangerous. For now, markets will pass every syllable. Naval commanders will adjust patrols and rules of engagement. Diplomats will count the hours between meetings and phone calls, and citizens in capitals, from Washington to Taipei, from Abu Dhabi to Tokyo, will measure what happens next, not in immediate triumphs, but in whether the summit yields the kind of practical, verifiable steps that reduce the chance of miscalculation. In the weeks ahead, expect a tug-of-war between short-term tactical gains and long-term strategic prudence. Expect statements meant for domestic audiences to jostle against confidential diplomacy designed to avoid catastrophe, and expect that, as always in GEOPA. Politics, the smallest misstep at sea or the most inflammatory line in a public exchange could have outsized consequences. The summit in Beijing will not by itself resolve the multiply and tangled crises pressing at the edges of global order. But it will be a moment that reveals whether two major powers can still negotiate limits to competition, or whether those limits will fray, and with them the fragile stability the world has relied upon for decades. The next 2 weeks may tell us whether measured restraint can hold, or whether the edges of the mat give way to a new and more dangerous geography.